Part 3. Atop the Volcano. Chapter 8. High Commission. The call came around 5 a.m. on April the 26th, awakening the most powerful man in the land, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. The message was that there had been an explosion and fire at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, but the reactor was intact. Gorbachev's first reaction was to ask how the explosion could have happened. After all, the scientists had always assured us, the country's leaders, that the reactor was absolutely safe, he recalled. Academician Aleksandrov said, for example, that an RBMK reactor could be installed even on Red Square, since it was no more dangerous than a samovar. Apart from being puzzled and probably annoyed by being awakened at such an early hour, Gorbachev did not show much concern at the time. In the first hours and even the first day after the accident, there was no understanding that the reactor had exploded and that there had been a huge nuclear emission into the atmosphere, remembered Gorbachev later. There was no need to wake up other members of the Soviet leadership or interrupt the weekend and call an emergency session of the Politburo. Gorbachev approved the creation of a state commission to look into the causes of the explosion and deal with its consequences. That was standard procedure in the case of high-profile accidents, and the initial alert concerning Chernobyl noted the possibility of 4 different types of emergency: nuclear, radioactive, fire, and explosion. Nikolai Ryzhkov, the chairman of the Soviet cabinet, had been on the phone at least since 2:40 a.m. when he had called the premier of the Ukrainian government, Oleksandr Lyashko, to inform him about the accident. Ryzhkov did not know much at the time and did not learn the details until later in the morning. He recalled later that he had not been particularly worried. The son of a miner from eastern Ukraine, Ryzhkov had spent his entire career in managerial positions in the Soviet machine-building industry, which was prone to accidents involving malfunctioning equipment or glitches in the technology. Well, what could have happened there? He asked himself. Any station, atomic, steam, coal or gas, must have a turbine, a wheel with all kinds of blades, said Ryzhkov, recalling his thoughts of that morning. We had cases, for instance, of a wheel breaking. There was a defect in it somewhere. Sometimes the roof was penetrated. Part of a turbine would be hurled right onto the roof. They learned how to deal with such accidents. We replaced the equipment and carried on. It was a big country. Accidents happened all the time, and this seemed to be just one more mishap. Ryzhkov began to realize that the accident was much worse than it had at first seemed when he arrived at his office and spoke with Anatoly Mayorets, the Minister of Energy, who oversaw the Chernobyl plant. It appeared that the damage was not limited to the turbine generator poking a hole in the roof. At a minimum, there was a lot of machinery to be replaced before things could return to normal. Mayorets, a new minister who had been in office less than a year, was reluctant to deliver bad news to his boss. At the 27th Party Congress, he had promised to double the number of reactors to be constructed in the next 5 years, and offered an innovative way of achieving that goal: cutting the time allocated for the design of nuclear plants. By the time he had been in office for a few months, he had met several deadlines for the production of electrical energy and the stabilization of the Soviet electrical grid, which had previously experienced sudden surges and drops in the supply of electricity. And now this. News of the accident caught Mayorets by surprise. He was at work by 5 a.m. trying to get a handle on developments in faraway Pripyat. Thank goodness the radiation levels seemed to be within the norm, and the number of casualties low. But the accident would delay the fulfillment of the year's production plans and compromise the stability of the grid. They had to put the plant back into operation as soon as possible, otherwise the plan figures and Mayorets's career prospects would be in trouble. The report, prepared by Mayorets's ministry for the Central Committee of the Communist Party, reflected that generally upbeat mood. The report was signed by Mayorets's first deputy, Alexei Makuchin. the former energy minister of Ukraine, on whose watch the Chernobyl power plant had been built. It was based on reports submitted by Viktor Brukhanov, who had informed party officials that the explosion that occurred at 1:21 a.m. had destroyed the roof and part of the walls of Unit 4. It had caused a fire that was extinguished by 3:30 a.m. 25 firemen and 9 engineers had been hospitalized, but the medical officials saw no reason for any special measures to protect workers at the plant or for evacuating the population of Pripyat. The operators were cooling down the reactor, and the ministry was examining the causes of the accident and its consequences. Everything seemed to be under control. Protocol called for the creation of a commission to look into the causes of the accident. Someone in the Central Committee, or the Council of Ministers, decided to appoint as high-profile a commission as possible. The man chosen to chair it was Mayorets's boss, Boris Shcherbina, the 66-year-old deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers in charge of the energy sector. He looked, spoke, and acted tough. The commission included Mayorets himself and a number of his ministry's officials and scientists, as well as experts from other ministries and the Academy of Sciences. The first members of the commission to be appointed, middle-ranking experts from various ministries, began to leave Moscow for Pripyat around 9 a.m. They were flown to Kiev and taken from there either by another plane or by car to Pripyat and the nuclear plant. More planes would arrive that day, bringing scores of officials and experts from Moscow to the nuclear plant. Minister Mayorets left on a plane that took off from a Moscow airport around 4 p.m. on April the 26th. He did not expect to spend more than 2 days in Pripyat. It was Saturday, and he hoped that by early the following week everything would fall into place. The Central Committee's top nuclear industry expert, Vladimir Marin, seemed to be upbeat as well. He was encouraged by the good news that the radiation levels allegedly had not risen. Amazingly, there is no contamination, he told a member of the travelling party. It's a really terrific reactor. Gennady Shcherbina, Mayorets's deputy in charge of nuclear plants, who had been recalled from his vacation in the Crimea, was making plans to create groups of experts who would assess the damage and advise on repairing it as soon as possible. Construction managers were thinking about how to fix the roof of the unit. The first signs that things might be worse than they appeared came when the delegation landed in Kiev. The Ukrainian energy minister informed Mayorets that radiation levels at the plant were above the norm. From Kiev they flew to Pripyat, where, to their surprise, they were not greeted by the plant's managers. Neither Brukhanov nor his second-in-command, Chief Engineer Fomin, was anywhere in sight. But the always energetic and decisive Vasil Kizima, the director of plant construction, was on hand. While local party officials took care of Mayorets, Marin and Mayorets's nuclear expert, Shcherbina, immediately got into Kizima's Jeep-type vehicle and drove to the damaged reactor. There they got their first shock. The devastation was much greater than Brukhanov's reports had led them to believe. They could see the scope of destruction from the road. "Look at the mess we've landed ourselves in. That's just great. Now we're all lumped together with Brukhanov and Fomin," complained Marin. Kizima also blamed Brukhanov. Shcherbina remembered Kizima saying that he had never expected anything else from that marshmallow, Brukhanov. In Kizima's opinion, it was bound to happen sooner or later. Kizima stopped his car near a pile of rubble by the wall of Unit 4. They got out. Without the slightest fear, remembered Shcherbina. Kizima was walking about, looking very much in charge, and lamenting the fact that after all the effort that had gone into building the place, now they were walking around among the wreckage of the fruits of their labour. Marin was enraged by what he saw, swearing he kicked a block of graphite. Not until later did Shcherbina realize that the graphite was producing 2,000 rontgens of radiation per hour. The particles of uranium fuel on the site emanated 20,000 rontgens. "We had difficulty breathing," remembered Shcherbina. Our eyes smarted, we were coughing severely, and deep inside we felt extremely worried and vaguely anxious to get out of there and go somewhere else. They drove to the plant's underground bunker, where they found the managers. The arrival of the experts from Moscow and then of Majorets and his assistants came as a major relief to Brukhanov and his management team at the station. Feeling depressed and guilty, they were still confused about the causes of the accident. The arrival of the higher-ups removed primary responsibility for the future from their shoulders. They were now responsible only for the past. The visitors noticed that the managers of the power plant were performing any task given to them, but making no decisions on their own. The arrival of the top people had a great psychological effect, and they were all very serious, those in the top ranks. They inspired confidence. It seemed that people who knew and understood everything had arrived, recalled the party boss of the plant, Serhii Parashin. We, the personnel, did something or other mechanically, like drowsy flies. No matter how angry Marin and Shasharin were with Brukhanov and Fomin for what had happened, they seemed to join the two locals in denying the severity and consequences of the accident. After experiencing difficulty breathing and kicking around pieces of graphite that could only have come from the active zone of the reactor, the two senior officials still refused to admit that the reactor had exploded. The myth of the reactor's safety was shared by everyone in the industry, from top to bottom. Besides, as Marin had observed earlier that day, they were now all together when it came to responsibility for the accident. Marin was the key figure in the Central Committee responsible for running the nuclear energy sector, and Shasharin, as Deputy Energy Minister, bore the same responsibility on the government level. Minor accidents could be blamed on subordinates, but the one they had just seen was too big to be handled that way, and to assume that it was even bigger bordered on the impossible. It was easier to believe that the reactor was intact. In that case, they at least knew what could be done. If it had been destroyed, there was nothing in their training or experience to fall back on. Meanwhile, Majorets, the most senior man on the spot, convened the first meeting of the experts from Moscow and the local officials at the headquarters of Pripyat's Communist Party committee. He seemed unmoved by reports from local officials that radiation levels were high, information that he and the others had not received in Moscow. His task was still the same: to fix the problem in a few days, connect the reactor to the grid and go back to Moscow. The May Day holidays were around the corner. Shasharin, who had just returned from his inspection of Unit 4 with Marin and Kizima, was the main speaker. He said that the situation was under control. Cooling water was being pumped into the reactor, and boric acid was about to be delivered to stop the fire. Experts were taking a helicopter flight above the power plant to assess its current status. Marin, upset by what he had seen at Unit 4, asked those present where the graphite had come from. Majorets directed the question to Brukhanov, who looked extremely tired, his face ashen, his eyelids puffed up, according to one eyewitness account. He found it hard to speak in public under normal circumstances. It was twice as difficult now. He rose slowly and took his time answering the minister's question. Eventually he spoke. "It's hard to imagine. The graphite we received for the new No. 5 unit is all there, intact. I originally thought it must be that graphite, but it's all there. In that case, it might have been ejected from the reactor." In plain language, that meant the reactor had exploded. But the experts refused to grasp what had happened, or at least to admit it. When Majorets asked Shasharin, who was complaining about the high radiation levels, what had caused the accident, his chief nuclear officer told him that it was not clear yet. It seemed that all those responsible for the disaster were anxious to delay as long as possible the awful moment of reckoning, when the truth would be disclosed in every detail, concluded Vladimir Shishkin, a ministry official who was present at the meeting. The meeting went on, with local officials making their reports to the powerful minister from Moscow. The party boss of Pripyat reported that the situation in the city was calm. Weddings were taking place. but the report of General Hennady Berdov, a handsome, silver-haired Ukrainian Deputy Minister of the Interior, was more worrisome. He had been at the scene since 5 a.m. and spoke of the sacrifice made by the police officers patrolling the contaminated areas. Not one of them had deserted his post. But there were things Berdov wanted the Commission to do. Trains had to be kept out of the area, as the railway line passed 500 meters away from the damaged reactor. Berdov also surprised the minister by telling him that the Ukrainian authorities had mobilized about 1,100 buses and were moving them to Pripyat in case there was a need to evacuate the city. "What's all this talk of evacuation? Are you trying to start a panic?" asked Mayorets, who was still hoping to return to Moscow before May Day. Brukhanov joined the discussion, saying that he had suggested evacuation earlier that morning to an assistant to Boris Cherchibina, but had been told to wait until the arrival of the Commission. Brukhanov's civil defense chief, Serhii Vorobev, reported to the Commission that the radiation level around the reactor exceeded 250 rontgens per hour, the upper limit that could be detected with the equipment at hand. Vorobev, dishevelled and distressed as always, demanded immediate evacuation. Brukhanov tried to calm him down. The trip that had begun with the assumption that there was no significant radioactivity, and the meeting that had begun with assurances that the situation in Pripyat was under control, had suddenly taken a turn that Mayorets was desperately trying to avoid. He asked to see the operators of the reactor in order to question them about what had happened, but was told that they were all in the hospital. The medical officials present at the meeting told him that their skin had turned brown from radiation tan. They had received 3 to 4 times the lethal dose of radioactive exposure. A novice in the field of nuclear energy, Mayorets hoped that if they shut down the reactor, the ill effects would cease. But Shasharin told him that the operators had already shut down the reactor, which was now in an iodine pit. This meant that the reactor was temporarily disabled because of a buildup of short-lived nuclear poisons, especially isotopes of iodine and xenon. When the reactor was in this poisoned state, the nuclear reaction usually slowed down. Although Shasharin did not say so, he and other nuclear experts were concerned that once the reactor emerged from the poisoning, the reaction would pick up speed. That, in turn, could lead to another explosion, wiping the plant, the nearby city, and the members of the Commission off the face of the earth. Mayorets showed no visible signs of stress. As one of his subordinates noted, he was his usual dapper self, his hair parted neatly on his pink skull, his round face as expressionless as ever. Perhaps he simply failed to understand. Mayorets seemed more concerned about the proposed evacuation of the city than about the possibility of a new explosion. The top officials wanted to avoid panic, but even more they were trying to avoid responsibility for ordering an evacuation. That would mean admitting that something terrible had happened. There had not been an evacuation for any reason since World War II. Even suggesting something of the sort would be detrimental to one's career. What if you are mistaken? Mayorets asked those advocating evacuation. He continued, "I am opposed to evacuation. The danger is clearly exaggerated." They decided to take a break. Mayorets was standing next to Shasharin, smoking in the corridor of the party headquarters, when 2 experts from Moscow, Boris Prushinsky and Konstantin Polushkin, showed up. Prushinsky was the chief engineer of the Department of Nuclear Power Stations at the Ministry of Energy and Electrification. Polushkin was a senior scholar at the research institute that had designed the RBMK reactor. They had more expertise on the reactor between them than anyone else on the High Commission. They had taken the 9 a.m. plane from Moscow and arrived in Pripyat in the early afternoon. The first thing they did, after lunching in a restaurant that was also hosting a wedding party, was to find a helicopter. With a pilot and a photographer, they flew over the station to take a look at Unit 4 from above. What they saw left no doubt in their minds that the Commission's working assumption was wrong. The reactor was not intact. It had exploded. Prushinsky and Polushkin told Majorets what they had seen. The central hall of the reactor building was gone, destroyed by the blast. So were the main circulation pump room and the steam separator room. An explosion of steam in the reserve water tank simply could not have caused so much damage. The upper biological shield of the reactor was now a bright cherry red from the extreme heat and was lying at an angle over the reactor vault, recalled Prushinsky. There were pieces of graphite all over the place. The reactor was no more. Its radioactive innards were scattered everywhere. It was safe to say that the reactor was utterly finished. It was one thing for Prushinsky to say that, and quite another for Polushkin, a representative of the designer of the allegedly explosion-proof reactor, but he agreed with his colleague. "What should be done?" asked the distressed Majorets. "God knows," answered Prushinsky. "Right now I can't say. There is graphite burning in the reactor. That has to be extinguished before anything else. But how, and with what? We've got to think." Boris Chicherbina, deputy head of the Soviet government and chairman of the High Commission, arrived in Pripyat after 8 p.m. A round-faced, slightly balding man of medium build with dark hair and a decisive look in his eyes, he was calm and considerate, commanding the respect of his subordinates. A native of Ukraine who had begun his party career in the industrial city of Kharkiv, Chicherbina had spent most of his life as a regional secretary of the Communist Party in western Siberia, where he presided over the birth of the Tyumen oil and gas industry. In 1973 he was transferred to Moscow to become Minister of Construction of Oil and Gas Enterprises and Pipelines. 11 years later, in 1984, he was promoted to Deputy Prime Minister in charge of the energy sector of the government. Thus, nuclear energy was becoming an ever larger part of his portfolio, even though oil and gas were remaining extremely important in the Soviet industrial complex, bringing in the lion's share of the government's hard currency earnings. Chicherbina was a natural choice to lead an all-powerful commission on the Chernobyl accident. The only problem was that on the morning of April the 26th he was away from Moscow, visiting the Siberian city of Barnaul. It was his routine to hop onto a plane on weekends and visit construction sites and enterprises throughout the Soviet Union. April the 26th was a Saturday, and Chicherbina, faithful to his routine, was on the road. Summoned by his boss, Nikolai Ryzhkov, he returned to Moscow, where the two officials had a 20-minute conversation about the accident, still believed not to be causing any rise in radiation levels. Then Chicherbina picked up a number of experts still in Moscow and flew with them to Kiev. During the flight, Chicherbina got a crash course in the history of nuclear disasters from Valery Legasov, a bespectacled 49-year-old of medium build with a big nose and prominent lips. Legasov was the first deputy of Anatoly Aleksandrov, the director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. Instead of relaxing, Legasov had spent the entire Saturday at a meeting of party and managerial personnel at the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, a nuclear power monster that all but owned the Kurchatov Institute. True to my character and to habit, ingrained over many years, I called for a car and went to the party management meeting, recalled Legasov. He had first heard the news of the Chernobyl accident before the meeting, but it did not seem like a matter of major concern then. The main speaker at the event, the 87-year-old minister, Yefim Slavsky, who had helped design and produce the RBMK reactor in the 1960s together with Legasov's boss, Aleksandrov, spoke for 2 hours but mentioned the accident only in passing. We had all become accustomed to hearing that aged but very demagogically active man speak energetically for an hour in a loud and confident voice about how excellent and wonderful everything was in our bailiwick, recalled Legasov. This time, singing a paean to atomic energy as always and to the great successes achieved in its construction, he mentioned quickly that now, true, there had been some kind of accident at Chernobyl, The Chernobyl station belonged to the neighbouring ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Electrification, so he noted quickly that they had made some kind of mess there, an accident of some sort, but it would not halt the development of atomic energy. During the break after Slavsky's report, Legasov learned that he had been appointed to the State Commission headed by Shecherbina. He was told to be at the airport at 4 p.m. There went the weekend, thought Legasov. At the institute he collected whatever technical information he could find on RBMK reactors and the Chernobyl nuclear plant, spoke with colleagues who knew the reactors inside and out, and headed for the airport to catch his flight. On the plane he shared his knowledge of the nuclear industry with Boris Shecherbina. Someone mentioned the 3 Mile Island accident in the United States. Legasov stepped in. I tried to tell Boris Yevdokimovich about the accident at the 3 Mile Island station that had taken place in the United States in 1979, recalled Legasov. Caused by the malfunctioning of one of the plant's non-nuclear systems, the accident had led to the escape of nuclear reactor coolant and a rapid increase of radiation levels, partly the result of the operator's failure to identify the initial problem. It was rated a 5 on the 7-point scale of nuclear accidents, 7 being the highest. 140,000 people had voluntarily left the 20-mile zone around the nuclear plant. Legasov argued that most probably the cause of that accident had no bearing on the events in Chernobyl because of the fundamental difference in the construction of the apparatus. He was right. The Americans had used a pressurized water reactor that was much safer than the RBMK. The American reactor also had a concrete containment structure, and the RBMK did not. The Soviet Commission was about to deal with a much more dangerous situation. What struck Legasov once they landed in Kiev was the cavalcade of black government cars and the agitated crowd of Ukrainian leaders. Their faces were all agitated. They had no precise information, but said that the situation was bad there. Legasov and his colleagues got into the limousines waiting for them and drove to Chernobyl and then to Pripyat. The scenery on the way was beautiful, and those members of the commission who arrived during the day had a chance to fully enjoy it. Spring was already in full flower, and the orchards were in bloom. There were geese on the river Uj, remembered one of them. The sensation of nature's bounty did not abandon us the whole way. Shecherbina and Legasov missed most of that scenery. The sun went down soon after 7 p.m., and they were confronted with a different picture. As we were approaching the city of Pripyat, we were struck by the appearance of the sky, some 8 or 10 kilometers from Pripyat. There was a deep red, or more precisely, a crimson glow above the station, recalled Legasov. At 8:20 p.m., Shecherbina and his entourage entered the building of the Pripyat Party Committee, where the rest of the members of the commission were meeting under the chairmanship of Anatoly Mayorets. Mayorets's deputy for nuclear plants, Gennady Shesharin, who had just returned from his helicopter flight over the reactor, immediately approached him. Shesharin's claim that the reactor had been destroyed surprised Shecherbina. The temperature within the reactor was rising. Proshinsky had seen the graphite in the reactor heated to a cherry red, whereas Shesharin saw yellow. The radiation levels were high. Shesharin suggested the immediate evacuation of Pripyat. This came as a complete shock to Shecherbina, but he remained calm and collected. He told Shesharin that evacuation would cause a panic worse than the radiation itself. Shecherbina began a new meeting of the commission that turned into a brainstorming session. Everyone now accepted what had been unthinkable only hours, if not minutes, earlier. A meltdown had occurred, and the reactor's core was damaged, spreading radioactivity all over the place. The question was how to stop it from burning and producing ever more radioactivity. They bounced ideas off one another. Shecherbina wanted to use water, but they explained to him that water could make things even worse. It was one thing to pump water into the reactor to cool it off, and quite another to try dousing a nuclear fire with water. It could make the fire more intense. Shcherbina did not give up on the idea, but was willing to consider alternatives. Someone suggested using sand, but how would they bring it to the reactor? What about helicopters? Shcherbina had already called military helicopter and chemical units into the area. Their commanders were en route to Pripyat as they spoke. It began to look as if the authorities finally knew what they were doing. Shcherbina's demeanor changed in a matter of minutes. He finally knew what had to be done. Despite the late night, actually the pre-dawn hours, Shcherbina did not appear to be tired, recalled his assistant, B.N. Motovilov, when General Nikolai Antoshkin, Chief of Staff of Kiev's District Air Force Command, crossed the threshold of the Pripyat Party headquarters sometime after midnight. Shcherbina greeted him with the words, "Everything depends on you and your helicopter pilots now, General." He ordered Antoshkin to start dropping sandbags on the reactor right away. The Air Force commander replied that it was impossible. The helicopters were not there yet. Shcherbina agreed to wait, but only until daybreak. He had no other choice. Something else that he postponed until morning was the evacuation of Pripyat. What he had considered unacceptable spreading of panic only a few hours earlier had become an imperative by the late hours of April the 26th. Soon after 9 p.m., while the members of the Commission were brainstorming about what to do with the reactor, which everyone now agreed was damaged, the reactor suddenly awakened. 3 powerful explosions illuminated the dark red sky above Unit 4, sending red-hot pieces of fuel rods and graphite into the air. It was a striking spectacle, remembered Leonid Khamianov, one of the experts from Moscow who observed the scene from the 3rd floor of the Pripyat Party headquarters. It's hard to say whether it was the result of the reawakening of the reactor, or whether water happened to fall onto the burning graphite at that moment, causing an explosion of steam, he observed. It looked as if the worst-case scenario was now coming to pass. Earlier in the day, experts had predicted a possible chain reaction, starting as soon as the reactor emerged from the iodine well. Some suggested 7 p.m., others 9 p.m., as the time when the reactor would reawaken. Now it seemed as if those predictions were on the mark. The explosions might be the first indications of a much bigger blast to come. They had no choice but to wait and see. But even without further explosions, those that occurred between 9 and 10 p.m. had put the population of the city in greater danger than it had been in during the day. The wind, which had previously been hardly noticeable, suddenly picked up, driving radioactive clouds northward from the damaged reactor to cover parts of the city. Radiation levels increased on the city plaza in front of party headquarters in downtown Pripyat, rising from 40 to 330 micro-rontgens per second, or 1.2 rontgens per hour. Late in the evening, Armen Abagayan, the director of one of the Moscow nuclear power research institutes who had dispatched to Pripyat as a member of the government commission, approached Shcherbina and demanded the evacuation of the city. Abagayan had just returned from the plant where the explosions in the reactor had caught him unawares. He and his colleagues had to seek shelter under a metal bridge. I told him that children were running in the streets, people were hanging laundered linen out to dry, and the atmosphere was radioactive, remembered Abagayan. That made an impression on the normal human level. But according to government regulations that had been adopted in the Soviet Union back in 1963, evacuation of the civil population was not necessary unless the radiation dose accumulated by individuals reached the 75 Rontgen mark. Calculations had shown that with the existing level of radioactivity, the intake might be about 4.5 Rontgens per day. The threshold of 75 Rontgens had not yet been reached, and Yevgeny Vorobev, a deputy minister of health and the senior medical officer on the commission, was reluctant to take responsibility for ordering an evacuation. The debate continued. Some members of the commission later credited Legasov with making a key contribution to the debate. Ivan Pluish, the head of the Kiev regional administration, remembered, "Academician Legasov placed his hand on his heart as if taking an oath, and said, "I am pleading with you to evacuate the people, because I don't know what will happen to the reactor tomorrow. It is ungovernable. We are pouring water, but we don't know where it's going. We are doing something that has never been done before, and as a scientist, I can't foretell today what the consequences may be. I therefore plead that you evacuate the people." According to Plokhy, Vorobyev was opposed to evacuation. People can be evacuated when radiation reaches 25 Ber. That is our norm, he told the gathering, referring to the biological equivalents of Rontgens. But here, you see, people have been talking about millirontgens and Rontgens. We can't confirm the need for evacuation. According to Legasov, the nuclear scientists in the room, having a presentiment that the dynamic would change in an unfavorable direction, insisted that a decision on evacuation be made without fail. The medical people naturally yielded to the physicists. Legasov, Abagian, and other scientists eventually convinced Shcherbina. Sometime around 10 or 11 p.m. on April the 26th, Shcherbina, having listened to our discussion, made the decision to evacuate without fail, remembered Legasov. But Shcherbina's decision was not sufficient. They told one party secretary, and he said, "I can't give you my agreement to this," recalled Plokhy. They got through to another, who also expressed sympathy, but said that he could not give his assent, and it was impossible to get through to a third. Eventually, Shcherbina phoned his boss, Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov. "Shcherbina called me on Saturday evening," recalled Ryzhkov, and reported on the situation. "We've measured the radiation. Pripyat has to be evacuated. Immediately. The station is close by and it's emitting radioactive contagion. And people in the city are living it up full blast. Weddings are going on. I decided, evacuation tomorrow. Prepare trains and buses today, and tell the people to take only the bare necessities, money, documents, and nothing more, no furniture." By 1 a.m. on April the 27th, local officials in Pripyat had received an urgent order from Shcherbina to prepare lists of citizens for evacuation. They were given 2 hours to do the job. The evacuation was supposed to start early in the morning. It had been a long day for those assembled in the conference room of the Pripyat party headquarters. It had begun with the shocking news of the explosion and progressed through the stages of confusion, disbelief, and denial. But by now denial had given way to full cognizance of the disastrous situation, with the worst perhaps still to come. Had the chain reaction begun again? Would the explosions resume? And if so, what would happen to the city of Pripyat and other population centers nearby? Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was only 130 kilometers away from the power plant. They had no answers to those questions, and there was little they could do during the night. They had to wait for dawn, hoping that it would not bring further trouble.